Today, we want to focus on a country which has a unique history, Namibia. Today we call the country Namibia, but it was not Namibia in the early days. The country was known as German West Africa and was occupied by the Germans from the year 1884 to the year 1915. And it is important to understand the history of that particular country. When the Germans came, they, in a manner of speaking, Germanized the country. And if you look at the names of the major cities, even up today, you'll find Windhoek, which is the capital, Swakopmund, which is the sea resort, which was founded by the Germans. And what the Germans did was amazing. I've visited Namibia on several occasions, and you see, even as we speak in Windhoek, that African populations are still settled in the manner that the Germans planned it, the Nama, the Herero. And one of the first major genocides to be committed was the genocide of the Herero peoples. Of course, in the recent past, the Germans have tried to atone for their sins, but is a very tokenist atonement. And it is important to understand how the Germans lost this territory, and this was after the First World War, when the territory of Southwest Africa was then mandated to the administration of South Africa by the League of Nations. And when they did so, the administration was supposed to be on behalf of the League of Nations by the South African administration. And when they entered into that territory, you must remember that the administration of South Africa then transitioned into the apartheid regime in 1948, when the apartheid regime of Hendrik Verwoerd took over power. The South Africans then, of course, literally seized the country and were no longer responsive to the dictates of the League of Nations and the successor, the United Nations. And this ultimately culminated in Resolution 435. Resolution 435 of 1978 is significant, because at that time the United Nations did make a decision that Namibia or Southwest Africa should at that time be freed and should have democratic elections. But that did not happen. And that is what brings us back a little bit in terms of history. The struggle against Germans and against domination had started a little earlier. As early as 1880, Hendrik Witbooi was fighting the Germans, and it is through the activities of Hendrik Witbooi that some of the freedom fighters in Namibia were actually energized, courtesy of looking at his exploits. Sam Nujoma, who was the founder of the Ovamboland People's Organization in 1958, which changed its name to Southwest African People's Organization in 1960, has actually did say that he was impressed by the activities of Hendrik Witbooi. When SWAPO took over in 1960 under the leadership of Sam Nujoma, there were others who were with him who started the fight. Individuals such as Andimba Herman Toivo Yatoivo, who was himself imprisoned under the Terrorism Act in 1966 and spent nearly 16 years in Robben Island together with Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela. Sam Nujoma himself, of course, was exiled and went to Zambia and Tanzania and ultimately to West Africa. And ultimately, through struggle over a period of 30 years, We had Namibia regain our independence with the assistance of the Cubans, who were then in Angola at the invitation of Agostinho Neto and the MPLA movement, when the South African government was sponsoring the forces of UNITA led by Malheiro Savimbi. So that the struggle for independence of Namibia was led by SWAPO under the leadership of Sam Nujoma. And after that, in 1990, the wave was already taking place. In 1990, when Hendrik de Klerk became the president of South Africa, you see the beginning of the death of the apartheid regime and the beginning of the end of occupation of Namibia. And after independence, of course, in 1990, Sam Nujoma became the president. And after that, we know that Namibia has conducted herself in a manner that can be described as civilized and democratic. The stalwarts who are in the bush were the ones who have remained in power, with Sam Nujoma being succeeded by Hifikepunye Pohamba, who was himself in the bush with him, who succeeded by Hage Geingob, who was in the bush with him, and of course succeeded after Geingob died in the year 2024 by Nangolo Mbomba. And we have seen the election of the first woman who was herself in the bush, Netumbo Nandi Ndaitwah, who is the current president of Namibia. And we can indeed say that Namibia is a country that has demonstrated that power can be exercised in a civilized manner. And when we speak at this time, we know that in the very first half of the year 2025, Sam Nujoma himself left to be with his God, and Namibia remains alive and well as a beacon of democracy described, but the colonial question still remains, that land is still controlled by whites of German origin. And I hope that the administration of President Netumbo Nandi Ndaitwah is going to deal with that question of land, which is a historical burden which must be borne by the Germans specifically. And I hope that proper reparations will be made to the people of Namibia and land will be redistributed as was contemplated by the founders of Namibia. That is to say, Sam Nujoma. That is to say, Hifikepunye Pohamba. That is to say, Andimba Haman Toivo Ya Toivo. That is to say, Hage Geingob. That is to say, Nangolo Mbomba. That is the Namibia that we know. That is the Namibia which was dominated by the Germans. That is the Namibia that was harassed and dominated by the apartheid regime, but is now free. That is the Namibia that we recognize and celebrate. Ladies and gentlemen, the conversation about the many issues of the continent of Africa must remain alive, but we will come back again. But for the moment, let us say bye-bye.